Last week, I was sitting across from a young dean of inclusive excellence at a university that usually charges more for a semester than most people make in a year. She was glowing, practically vibrating with the kind of moral certainty you only see in people who believe they are on the right side of history. She spent 20 minutes showing me a glossy brochure for a new $50 million global equity center, explaining with a giddy smile how they'd finally restructured the engineering department to prioritize social impact over outdated merit-based metrics. To her, this wasn't just a policy change, it was a total victory. The long march through the institutions was complete, and she was standing on the summit. She checked her phone, likely expecting a confirmation for another massive federal research grant. But as I watched, the color drained from her face in real time. The notification wasn't a deposit, it was a surgical strike. The federal government had just announced the abrupt suspension of all grants and contracts to 38 elite universities, Harvard, Yale, and her own included. The reason? A failure to meet standards of institutional neutrality and excellence. Just like that, her $50 million monument to progress became a $50 million anchor. What was truly fascinating, though, wasn't just her shock, it was how quickly the revolutionary mask slipped. Within 10 minutes, she wasn't talking about dismantling systems anymore. She was frantically texting the campus facilities manager, asking how quickly they could script the word equity off the center's glass doors and replace it with student success. That instantaneous pivot from fervent ideological crusade to a desperate, panicked rebranding for survival exposed the hollow core of the modern academic establishment. It revealed that for all the talk of equity, the entire apparatus was built on the assumption that the taxpayer would never stop footing the bill for its own displacement. That moment was my first look at the great purge of 2025. It's not just a budget cut, it's a clinical, almost violent reassertion of reality against a system that thought it could outrun competence. When the checks stop clearing, the long march turns into a very fast retreat, and we are left with a single burning question. What happens to a civilization when it finally decides to stop subsidizing its own decline?
Wow. That story really sets the stage perfectly for what we need to unpack today. It's a perfect microcosm of this entire deep dive.
It really felt like watching a whole worldview collapse in, a matter of minutes.
It did. And it captures the underlying structural and ideological decay that made a moment like that purge in 2025 not just possible, but maybe even inevitable.
So that's our mission for this deep dive then, to get to the bottom of that decay.
Exactly. We need to examine how a system gets built on administrative bloat, on this kind of ideological capture, and on a systematic erosion of merit. All the things you actually need to maintain institutional competence.
Right. That pivot she made from ideologue to just a panicked manager trying to save her budget.
That pivot is everything. It confirms the precise vulnerability of the entire modern elite establishment. It revealed that its whole elaborate ideological structure was, in a way, parasitic.
Parasitic how?
It wasn't built on self-sufficiency or, true conviction. It was built entirely on the assumption of endless external subsidy. The assumption that the checks would just keep coming no matter what.
Okay, let's unpack this. The scenario I saw, this huge, centralized, ideologically driven institution, it seems to operate with this sense of moral carte blanche.
Mm-hmm.
And that points directly to a collapse of public faith in those elite structures. But before we get into the ideology itself, we have to understand the structure, right? The framework they operate within.
Yes. And that framework, which political thinkers have been analyzing for decades, is often called the managerial state.
The managerial state. Okay.
That's really the starting point. The rise of the managerial state, or sometimes you'll hear it called the administrative state, is the structural precondition for this kind of institutional failure.
So it's not just about bureaucracy getting bigger.
No, it's more than that. It's a whole process where the traditional model of, say, American limited constitutional government is systematically replaced by this centralized administrative apparatus. It's a shift in the whole philosophy of governance.
So how does that system fundamentally change how the government interacts with you, with the average citizen? What's the key difference between that constitutional model and a managerial one?
Well, thinkers like James Burnham and later Samuel T. Francis, they really distinguish them based on the source and the scope of power.
Okay.
In a limited government, power flows from constitutional law, from specific legislative limits that are debated and passed. But in the managerial state, power relies much more on administrative decree.
Decree, so rules made by unelected officials.
Precisely, and on centralized executive authority. Francis argued that this shift effectively replaces law with decree. It replaces federalism with a kind of executive autocracy, and it replaces limited government with an unlimited state. It's a very subtle but a radical change in where legitimacy comes from.
But wait, Congress still passes laws. I mean, we see them debating bills all the time. So how can you say law is replaced by decree?
That's a great question. It's because the sheer complexity and scope of modern life and governance mean that Congress often just delegates incredibly broad authority.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Congress will pass a law that says something like the EPA shall ensure clean air, or the FAA will regulate air safety. Very broad mandates.
Right.
And then it's up to those administrative agencies, the EPA, the FAA, to issue hundreds of thousands of pages of rules, regulations, and guidelines that actually define what clean air or air safety means in practice.
And those rules have the force of law.
They absolutely have the force of law.
Yeah.
But they're made by bureaucrats, not legislators. These are the administrative decrees. And they're fluid, they're constantly changing, and they lack that direct democratic accountability you get with a law passed by Congress.
So what justifies this massive expansion of power if it's not really confined by the Constitution in the same way?
This is the critical part. The managerial state justifies its own expansion by acting in the name of these abstract, almost utopian goals.
Okay, it's ringing a bell.
It doesn't claim to just, keep the roads paved or deliver the mail. It claims to be acting in the name of these lofty ideals like freedom, equality, brotherhood, or securing what are called positive rights.
So it's not about doing a job, it's about fulfilling a mission.
A moral mission. The system sustains itself by asserting its own moral necessity, that it alone can deliver these abstract, boundless goals. And that moral authority then legitimizes its continuous power of taxation, of spending, and of wealth redistribution. It transforms governance from a practical service into an endless moral crusade.
That connects the dots right back to that dean and her $50 million global equity center.
Exactly.
She wasn't building a sewer system or a bridge. She was trying to achieve global equity, a completely abstract, morally superior goal that she then used to justify restructuring a perfectly functional engineering department.
You've nailed it. And the moment that abstract moral goal takes precedence over the pragmatic reality of the institution's core function, that's when you see the rise of these conceptual variants, like the therapeutic managerial state and this idea of soft totalitarianism.
I want to pause on that term, soft totalitarianism. It sounds like a contradiction. How can a system of total control be soft? Is it just about political correctness?
It's deeper than just political correctness, though that's definitely one of its enforcement mechanisms. Yeah. The concept, which kind of evolved from looking at the failures of the 20th century, describes a form of control that avoids the physical brutalism of classical regimes.
So no gulags, no concentration camps.
Right. Instead of that, soft totalitarianism relies on things like constitutional erosion and, most importantly, the voluntary renouncement of individual freedom. And that's often accomplished through overwhelming social pressure or alignment with a sort of manufactured consensus.
So you don't need the secret police if you can just make it socially and professionally impossible to disagree.
Precisely. Dissenters aren't sent to a camp. They're simply labeled fringe, obscure, unscientific, or bigoted, and they're just pushed to the social and institutional margins.
They're canceled.
In modern terms, yes. When law is replaced by administrative decree, government intervention starts to favor these unaccountable regulations and social justice goals that govern private lives. And it's all justified by a consensus that's manufactured from within the managerial state itself, by its allied media, by academia, by NGOs. People accept the control because the cost to dissent is just higher than the benefit of staying silent and compliant.
And here's where it gets really, really interesting for me, because the whole scenario in the opening wasn't just about administrative growth. It was intensely moral, almost quasi-religious in its fervor.
Yes.
And that moves us into what some thinkers, like Paul Gottfried, have called therapeutic totalitarianism.
Gottfried really zeroes in on the ideological engine that powers this whole system. He argues that the managerial state, while it hasn't shrunk the welfare state, has fundamentally changed its purpose.
No.
It's moved away from purely material programs, like just handing out entitlements or building infrastructure, and it's moved toward outright behavior control and cultural transformation.
So it's not just about what you have, it's about who you are.
And who you should be. This represents a revolutionary, not just an administrative shift in society. The goal is now psychological alignment and moral management of the population.
But why did that shift happen? I mean, why move from managing poverty to managing people's feelings and behaviors?
The shift is powered by this hugely successful appeal to what Gottfried calls the politics of guilt and a pervasive theology of victimization.
A theology of victimization.
Yes. This ideology serves as a very deliberate substitute for traditional religious redemption, especially for the managerial elite themselves. The quest for religious redemption is, in this view, misplaced, so it finds a new home in, as the sources put it, worshiping at the multicultural shrine.
So the dean's moral certainty wasn't just political ambition. It was a deeply held, substitute religious conviction that was driving her every action.
It provided the moral authority that's necessary for her administrative role. In this new framework, sin is completely redefined. It's no longer about violating a traditional moral or spiritual law.
What is it then?
It's insensitivity toward designated minorities. And the path to redemption, the only way to achieve a kind of sanctified living in this system, is through a very specific form of penance.
And what does that institutional penance actually look like in practice?
It involves confessing that one belongs to a wicked race, specifically referencing historical European civilization, and then paying for that original sin through institutional self-debasement.
So things like affirmative action, quotas.
Exactly. Actively implementing policies like affirmative action, quotas, and this aggressive restructuring to favor social impact over objective merit. The dean restructuring that engineering department wasn't an administrative convenience for her. It was a public act of institutional repudiation. It was a required sacrifice to achieve redemption in this therapeutic model.
That framing, where any opposition to a policy is framed as moral opposition, even as evil, that must be incredibly effective at shutting down any internal challenge.
It is the ultimate tool. It's how you suppress internal dissent. If the policies themselves are a form of redemption, then opposing them means you are actively choosing sin. You're on the wrong side of history.
The bad guy.
The bad guy. The core purpose of the ideology is to make sure the therapeutic managerial state maintains its absolute claim of moral superiority. And that, in turn, justifies its continuous expansion of administrative control into every corner of private and professional life. The ideological fuel, the politics of guilt, allows the administrative bloat to thrive completely unchecked because it's immune to any practical or pragmatic critique.
Which brings us directly back to the university's administrative structure. That panic I saw in the dean's eyes, that willingness to sacrifice the entire ideological mission the second the funding stopped, it suggests the administration itself was the Achilles heel.
It was.
So let's look at that. Let's look at the structural correlation between this massive administrative bloat we see in higher education and the systematic erosion of meritocracy.
Well, the administration, especially in modern elite academia, it's often the primary vehicle for this ideological capture. And it has ballooned dramatically. I mean, you look at the numbers over the last few decades.
The number of administrators versus faculty.
Right. The number of tenured faculty has stayed relatively flat, but the number of diversity officers, compliance specialists, VPs of this and that, all these other managerial positions has just exploded. It's often outpaced the growth of the student body itself. This layer of abstraction is where competence starts to die.
And our sources identify things like meritocracy and discipline as core principles that a high-functioning society has traditionally valued. When that university prioritized social impact over outdated merit-based metrics in engineering, they were deliberately sacrificing these core principles. It was an explicit choice.
They were actively destroying the reality principle of the institution. I mean, think about it. An engineering department's core function is competence. It's designing safe bridges, reliable power grids, effective technology.
Things that have to work in the real world.
Things that have to work. Meritocracy is just the objective system for ensuring that competence is the top priority. When you substitute those objective, impartial metrics like test scores, technical skill, scientific output for these malleable, subjective metrics like social impact or ideological alignment, you inevitably sacrifice competence.
It seems like a slow suicide for the institution, though. I mean, why would they tolerate that trade-off?
Because for the managerial class running the institution, the ideological imperative is now more important than the core function. They believe the institution isn't primarily a functional entity, but a vehicle for cultural and psychological change. And this is where C.S. Lewis's warning becomes so profoundly relevant.
Lewis spoke about the dangers of seeking total control over nature and, well, over humanity itself.
He did. He cautioned that every increase in man's power over nature can turn out to mean an increase in the power of some men over others, with nature as its instrument.
Unpack that for me.
The managerial state is chasing these abstract goals: total human autonomy, control of destiny. But that autonomy is never universally distributed. It's only enjoyed by a shrinking, self-selected elite, the administrators and the ideological architects.
And everyone else, the masses, the dissenting subjects, they just don't count.
They don't count. The ideology of progress becomes this sophisticated instrument for the power of one group of men, the administrators, over all the others. And they use the institution's function, or even nature itself, as the instrument of that control. This is why the university's internal structure becomes so ripe for manipulation. Once merit is gone, the only remaining metric is compliance with the ideology of the ruling administrative class.
Okay, so once you have that vast, self-justifying administrative apparatus in place, prioritizing these abstract goals over demonstrated merit, it becomes incredibly vulnerable, not just to internal ideological forces, but to external influence as well.
Yes, very vulnerable.
This structural breakdown is perfectly mirrored in government regulatory bodies. Which brings us to the mechanism that lets these abstract ideological or financial interests completely supplant the public interest: regulatory capture.
Regulatory capture is the translation of all this theoretical decay into real-world actionable failure. It's defined pretty broadly as a form of corruption, where a political entity, a policymaker, or a regulator is co-opted to serve the interests of a minor constituency.
So in industry, a lobby.
It could be an industry, a highly organized lobby, or, as in the university example, an ideological interest group. And the predictable result is always a net loss for the general public, whose safety or financial security the regulator was supposed to be protecting in the first place.
That description seems to cover both things. It covers the dean compromising engineering standards to satisfy an ideological group, and it covers, say, the FAA compromising safety standards to satisfy an airline.
It does. The underlying mechanism is explained really well by public choice theory, which was notably formulated by the Nobel laureate George Stigler. His hypothesis was that regulation is rarely created for the public good. Instead, it's often acquired by the industry it regulates, and it's designed and operated primarily for that industry's benefit.
How can an entire agency that's meant to protect consumers be acquired without, just overt bribery?
It's a matter of focused resources. Think about it. The group with high-stakes interests, a massive corporation, a banking lobby, a focused ideological movement, they can dedicate immense resources to influence every single stage of policy: time, money, lobbyists, research.
Right. They have teams of people working on this full time.
Exactly. The general public, on the other hand, you or I, we only have a tiny individual stake in any single regulation. So we generally ignore the process. We don't have time. This huge disparity in resources and attention means that the captured party often ends up designing the very rules that are supposed to constrain it.
So we have the managerial state as the structure, therapeutic totalitarianism as the ideological fuel, and now regulatory capture as the mechanism for failure. You mentioned there are different types of capture, though.
Yes, and understanding the difference is key to seeing the scope of the problem. First, there's the one we all think of: materialist or financial capture.
The obvious kind.
The obvious kind. This involves direct financial incentives, bribery, political donations, or the infamous revolving door,
where regulators leave their government jobs and immediately go work for the companies they were just regulating.
For a huge salary, yes. It creates a very powerful, unspoken incentive to be lenient while you're in office, because you're essentially auditioning for your next job.
And the non-material type is often more subtle, right?
Much more subtle. That's non-materialist or cognitive capture. This happens because of cultural affinity or professional bias. Think about a highly technical industry like nuclear power.
Okay.
The regulating agency has to hire experts. Where do these experts come from? They primarily come from the highly skilled, highly paid personnel of the regulated industry itself.
There's nowhere else to get them.
Right. So their professional worldview, the internal consensus of the regulated industry, becomes the consensus of the regulatory agency. They start thinking the same way. They start prioritizing the same things like industry stability or protecting proprietary information over strict external public safety.
So if a nuclear regulator and a nuclear plant manager both went to the same specific engineering school, worked at the same 4 major firms, and they both prioritized the stability of the industry over demanding, say, expensive safety upgrades, That's cognitive capture in action, even without a single dollar changing hands illegally.
Exactly. The shared worldview leads to what sociologists call isomorphism. The two entities become structurally and culturally similar. But the phenomenon extends even further into something that some theorists call deep capture.
Deep capture. That sounds like the ideological component creeping back in.
It is. It's the realization that powerful entities have an incentive to control anything that has power over them. This means trying to control the media, trying to control academia, trying to control popular culture.
So it's not just about the regulatory agency anymore.
No. Businesses, or in our case, these ideological factions of the managerial state, they'll seek to capture these influential cultural spheres too. Deep capture is what ensures that the prevailing cultural and intellectual consensus supports the captured interests. It normalizes the policies of the administrative state so that they don't even seem controversial anymore.
Which brings us right back full circle to the dean. When that university's engineering department restructured itself to prioritize an ideological mandate over core competence, that was deep capture in action. Academia was aligning its output with the managerial therapeutic project. It was ensuring the intellectual consensus supported the structural status quo.
And that kind of systemic vulnerability, it has to be intellectually justified somehow. The question is, what's the intellectual engine driving the managerial state's ambition to radically remake reality and to justify this constant process of capture?
Let's pivot to that now, to those intellectual roots. Because like I said, the dean acted with the conviction of someone who believed she was executing a necessary historical mandate.
That ambition is rooted in a long history of revolutionary thought. Specifically, it draws from the intellectual legacy of the French Revolution. The core concept here is something the historian Jacob Talman termed totalitarian democracy.
Totalitarian democracy.
This is the foundational idea for movements that strive for what's called the piecemeal but revolutionary construction of social reality.
Can you elaborate on that distinction Talman made? I mean, what separates totalitarian democracy from the liberal democracy that was emerging at the same time in places like the US and Britain?
Well, liberal democracy accepts the inherent tension and conflict between individual freedom and social order. It accepts pluralism. It accepts messy compromise.
It's not perfect.
No, but totalitarian democracy is utopian. It aspires to perfectly reconcile social and individual freedom. It believes it can achieve this conceptually when all individual wills magically transform into one single, collective, and righteous will, the volonté générale, the general will.
And in theory, that would erase the difference between the state and society, creating this perfect, unified community.
In theory. But that's incredibly dangerous because if the state is society, then any opposition to the state is basically treason against humanity itself.
Right. It's not just a political disagreement anymore.
Exactly. If the collective will is assumed to be morally perfect, then any dissent is seen as fringe, selfish, or just illegitimate. And the modern method, which aligns with that idea of soft totalitarianism, uses democratic means and overwhelming social pressure to manufacture this unified will. People are persuaded to renounce their individual freedom, and the government stops safeguarding constitutional limits. It starts prioritizing the manufactured consensus of influential organizations, media, and activist groups instead. So it's not one big sudden revolution, it's this ongoing, creeping process. Exactly. It's what the French historian François Furet called piecemeal Jacobinism. The ideal of a radical, revolutionary construction of social reality never ended. It just transformed. The revolution, he said, has a birth but no end. The violent, condensed terror of the 18th century is replaced by a slow, humane, and administrative version that achieves the same long-term goal. The fundamental and continuous restructuring of reality to resolve the paradox of social organization once and for all.
This inherent ambition to resolve all paradoxes and create a perfect, unified system. It seems to create an unavoidable tension between two massive modern goals: freedom and equality.
That tension is the central dilemma that thinkers like Tocqueville and others really wrestled with. The philosopher Erich von Kuhn-Leddihn identified this conflict as being driven by these deep-seated psychological reasons, specifically envy and fear.
Envy and fear.
The psychological drive for equality is so intense because it rests on the assumption that if all are equal, nobody is superior, and nobody has to be afraid of everybody else.
So equality provides a psychological sense of safety, what the sources call safetism.
Yes. This identitarian drive rejects the traditional liberal urge for diversity of thought or action or social hierarchy. Instead, it seeks identical conditions in every single regard. And this often stems from a profound fear of failure or a reluctance to accept personal responsibility for difference.
But to achieve that absolute sameness, the people have to demand something to enforce it.
They inevitably demand a tutor, the centralized state, who can anticipate their thoughts and ensure their perfect safety and security.
And Lenin's conclusion was pretty stark, wasn't it? That perfect equality requires total coercion.
He said perfect equality is only possible in total slavery. The achievement of this leveling egalitarianism necessitates the coercive force of the state. He argued it leads citizens into what he called a blessed state of ignorance and improvidence, where they are psychologically insulated, not responsible, and eventually lose the capacity to think critically or act independently. They trade their liberty for guaranteed security and sameness.
Tocqueville observed this conflict in early America and France. And he concluded that in France, the passion for equality was infinitely stronger than the passion for freedom. He saw citizens just willingly sacrifice the latter.
Tocqueville's analysis is absolutely key to understanding the structure of the managerial state. He found that political equality and despotism mutually complete and assist each other. He argued that the French failure to reconcile freedom and equality was hugely exacerbated by administrative centralization, the very structure that the managerial state adopts.
And he found that this centralization wasn't even a radical Jacobin invention. It was a legacy inherited from the previous system, the monarchy, the ancient regime.
Precisely. Tocqueville's big insight was that this administrative centralization destroyed all the mediating structures that once existed.
What do you mean by mediating structures?
Things like local authorities, guilds, aristocratic hierarchies, churches, community bonds, all the things that stood between the individual and the central state power. By destroying those, centralization created atomized individuals, or what he termed inorganic individualism.
What does the atomized individual look like in this context?
They're individuals who are isolated from one another. They're attending solely to their own private interests, withdrawn into this narrow individualism that stifles public virtue and community action. This isolation, he said, makes indifference a kind of public virtue.
And that prepares people for bondage.
Critically, yes. It prepares them for bondage because they lose the ability to act in concert or to resist centralized power. They become easy to control by a centralized despotic government because they have no horizontal social connections left to mediate or resist that control.
So the dean's highly centralized university bureaucracy operating over a population of isolated, competitive individuals, it's the perfect modern environment for this kind of despotism. It's the structural consequence of prioritizing equality and centralization over freedom in those mediating structures.
It is. And this entire revolutionary effort hinges on one final, crucial intellectual component: the total rejection of the past.
What is the significance of the past in this framework? Why is it so important to reject it?
Because the true intellectual legacy of the French Revolution is this profound idea that man does not owe anything to his own origin, his culture, his civilization, his past. This is the philosophical break that makes modern social constructivism possible. If you owe nothing to the past, then you can tear down any institution, any tradition, any standard, no matter how long established, without any moral or intellectual consequence.
That sounds like the ultimate political freedom, the freedom to build everything completely anew.
It's the philosophy of Thomas Paine, who articulated this revolutionary mindset very clearly. He said, "Every age and generation must be as free to act for itself, in all cases, as the ages and generations which preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies."
The idea that the dead should not govern the living.
Absolutely. This credo denies permanence. It denies tradition. It denies sanctity. Everything is changeable. Everything is a construct in a constant flux of construction. This philosophical position allows for the radical remaking of any institution, including eliminating the concept of merit from an engineering department by removing any preceding obligation to tradition, core function, or established reality. This belief in the limitless possibility of constructing social reality is the ideological basis for the structural chaos we see in all these captured institutions. And if we connect this intellectual and structural decay to the bigger picture, we see the inevitable result. When the administrative state's policy becomes ideology-driven, prioritizing behavioral control and utopian ideals over core functions, the escalating competence crisis becomes unavoidable.
Especially in critical sectors.
Especially in critical sectors where objective reality and precision matter the most. The failure of that university's engineering department to maintain merit standards is mirrored by documented failures in regulatory bodies all across the government.
This is where the abstract theories of capture and managerial excess meet the ground, and the consequences are measured in lives and economic turmoil, not just in budget deficits. Let's look at aerospace safety and the failures of the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA.
The FAA is an excellent case study because aviation safety relies entirely on objective reality and technical merit. There's no room for error. But despite a long history of high safety standards, the FAA has faced repeated documented failures due to institutional capture. The core problem, particularly visible after the 737 MX crashes, was a systemic cultural breakdown.
The sources cite accusations of a pervasive culture of coziness between the FAA and the airlines it's supposed to regulate.
That's the perfect definition of cognitive capture merging with material capture. We saw earlier examples too, like the Southwest Airlines scandal back in 2007. FAA managers allowed 46 airplanes that were overdue for safety-critical inspections to continue flying commercially.
They just let them fly.
They did. Whistleblowers revealed that inspectors who actually wanted to enforce the rules were actively prevented from doing so by their supervisors, who were overly friendly with the airline.
A House investigation at the time found a systematic breakdown. They said it allowed 117 aircraft to be operated commercially without complying with safety rules. The chairman of the committee at the time explicitly called it malfeasance, bordering on corruption.
And that speaks to the financial and material capture. A willingness to prioritize the smooth operation and profit of the regulated entity over the strict enforcement of rules. But the deeper issue, the cognitive capture, resurfaced with the Boeing 737X tragedies. Investigations found that the FAA had delegated enormous authority to Boeing itself to certify its own aircraft designs.
They let Boeing certify its own planes
through an arrangement known as the Organization Designation Authorization Program. It's a classic structural invitation for capture.
So the regulated entity was acting as its own regulator, just using the FAA's stamp of approval.
Yes. The certification process was found to be severely compromised. It allowed the industry to dictate its own governing rules, often minimizing the importance of critical software changes that ultimately led to those crashes. This wasn't just a lapse, it was the managerial state structurally conceding its core function impartial safety oversight to the interests of the industry. And the results were catastrophic.
We see this exact same pattern of institutional failure repeated in the energy and environment sectors, specifically with offshore drilling and the regulation of nuclear power. Let's start with the Minerals Management Service, or MMS, which was regulating offshore oil drilling before the 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill.
The MMS was perhaps the most notorious textbook example of regulatory capture in modern history. The agency is just structurally compromised. It viewed its primary mission as facilitating rather than strictly regulating the oil industry. They were criticized for routinely granting drilling permits to BP and other companies without required endangered species assessments and for issuing blanket exemptions from environmental impact statements.
And the capture was so deep that they were ignoring specific warnings from other federal agencies.
Absolutely. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration issued very strong warnings, accusing the MMS of understating the likelihood and potential consequences of a major spill. Staff scientists within the MMS even reported that their own findings were being overruled or altered if they indicated a high risk of an accident.
So they were changing the science.
They were. The ideological or financial affinity was so strong that they were actively suppressing objective reality, because it conflicted with the industry's operational goals.
Following that disaster, the MMS was reorganized into 3 new bureaus. Was that enough to break the capture?
Well, structural reorganizations are often just administrative bandages. They don't necessarily address the cultural or cognitive capture underneath. In fact, the appointment of the new Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, who led the reorganization, was controversial, precisely because of his perceived weakness on conservation issues and his previous political ties to the energy sector. As we saw with the dean, administrative shuffling often fails to eliminate that deep-seated regulatory affinity that comes from cultural capture.
Now let's look at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. This sounds like an undeniable case of cognitive capture at the highest level.
It is frequently cited as the quintessential example where an entire agency is essentially controlled by the industry it is meant to regulate. I mean, even prominent political figures like Barack Obama publicly stated that the NRC had become captive of the industries that it regulates. And the failure here is particularly egregious because the stakes, public safety from a nuclear disaster, are completely non-negotiable.
So what were the specific failures that demonstrated this profound capture?
The cognitive capture manifested in the NRC actively collaborating with the nuclear industry to relax safety regulations for aging reactors. With a large portion of the nation's nuclear plants being decades old, wear and tear clogged lines, cracked parts, corrosion became a major safety concern. This led to numerous internal safety alerts.
But the NRC didn't force them to fix the problems.
No. They repeatedly granted permission to delay critical repairs, allowing problems to accumulate and worsen rather than forcing expensive, industry-disrupting fixes.
And the Vermont Yankee case, which happened just after the Fukushima disaster, seems to encapsulate this failure entirely.
It's the perfect illustration of prioritizing industry comfort over objective reality. Just 10 days after the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi disaster, which crucially involved the exact same General Electric Mark I reactor design, the NRC approved a 20-year license extension for the Vermont Yankee plant.
Wow.
This happened despite near-unanimous opposition from the Vermont state legislature and mounting evidence of serious safety issues.
The company running the plant had even denied the existence of underground pipes that were later found to be leaking radioactive materials.
And the NRC was functionally operating in a state of willful ignorance. They were completely unaware of these critical underground components. This demonstrates profound cognitive capture. The agency acted as a rubber stamp, automatically believing the industry's assurances and operational narrative over clear public safety concerns and credible state government opposition. Their primary concern was industry stability, not impartial regulation.
We see this same revolving door effect, pure material capture and financial regulation, which should concern everyone who lived through the 2008 crisis. Let's look at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC.
The SEC, which is tasked with policing Wall Street, was widely accused of acting in the interests of the banks and hedge funds it was supposed to regulate. They famously failed to investigate major frauds like those perpetrated by Bernie Madoff and Ellen Stanford, despite numerous detailed warnings from whistleblowers over many, many years. One internal whistleblower just called the agency non-functional, captive to the industry.
And the material capture here, that revolving door, it seems almost brazen in its speed.
It is endemic to the financial regulation system. Reports found hundreds of former SEC employees immediately filing statements notifying their intent to represent outside clients, the regulated entities, before the very commission they had just left. The incentive structure rewards regulatory leniency. Furthermore, whistleblowers revealed that the SEC had systematically undermined future enforcement by routinely destroying documents related to thousands of preliminary inquiries that were closed without a formal investigation.
Destroying documents related to firms like Madoff, Goldman Sachs, and Lehman Brothers, the very firms at the center of the 2008 crisis.
Yes. This systematic destruction of evidence severely handicapped the ability of later investigators to build comprehensive cases against those firms. It's a stunning example of material capture protecting the industry, not just through leniency, but by actively neutralizing the historical record of its own misconduct.
And finally, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is the most powerful regulatory bank in the country, has a structural conflict of interest built directly into its leadership selection.
It does. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is tasked with regulating Wall Street, but its president is selected by a board that is dominated by the chief executives of the very banks it oversees.
So the banks pick their own regulator.
Effectively, yes. During the run-up to the 2008 crisis, the then president of the New York Fed maintained an unusually close and sympathetic relationship with the heads of those Wall Street institutions. This deep affinity, this cognitive capture, prevented the regulator from acting decisively to curb the dangerous, crisis-inducing strategies of the banks. The regulator was psychologically aligned with the institutions it was supposed to control.
These examples, spanning aerospace, energy, and finance, they really underscore the pervasive nature of this competence crisis. Whether the capture is financial or cultural or ideological, the outcome seems to be exactly the same.
It is. The managerial state prioritizes its own perpetuation and its abstract goals over the objective reality that's required for public safety and functional infrastructure.
Absolutely. The regulatory failures aren't just anomalies or one-offs, they're the predictable and repeated outcomes of the structural and ideological system we've been analyzing. When the rejection of the past and this ambition for revolutionary social construction drives administrative action, competence is always the first inevitable casualty.
We've traced the intellectual path from these abstract utopian ideals, this piecemeal Jacobinism, all the way to the structural atrophy that's manifested as the therapeutic managerial state and widespread regulatory capture.
So the crisis isn't about minor policy debates. It's really about institutional integrity and the systematic erosion of the reality principle. That dean I saw, scrambling to rename her equity center. That was the visceral, material reaction to the check stopping. It was the moment objective reality, in the form of budgetary constraints and external demands for competence, reasserted itself with clinical violence.
And to synthesize this entire deep dive, the modern establishment, whether it's in academia or government regulation, created a system built on three core pillars. First, you have utopian social constructivism, which is derived from that French revolutionary legacy, the idea that everything can be built anew without any regard for the past.
Okay, pillar one.
Second, you have centralized administrative power, Tocqueville's centralization, which creates these atomized individuals who are easily controlled by the managerial state. And third, you have the resulting operational incompetence that is enabled by regulatory capture.
And this entire ideological and structural edifice, it was fundamentally built on a single, very vulnerable assumption.
A single assumption.
The assumption of an endless, unquestioning subsidy, financially from the taxpayer and culturally from the compliant academic consensus.
The moment that assumption is challenged by an external demand for institutional neutrality and excellence, a demand that translates directly into a mandate for merit and competence, the system's deep structural flaws are instantaneously exposed.
The revolutionary mask slips.
It slips, revealing this desperate administrative entity that's focused only on its own immediate survival. The immediate and panicked retreat from ideology confirms that the ideological crusade was, for the administrative class, merely a function of subsidized power, not genuine conviction.
That brings us back to the philosophical consequences of this long-term decline. When an elite-led system embraces an ideology of progress that prioritizes its own administrative power and behavior control over the simple necessity of objective reality, like allowing ideological metrics to displace merit in engineering, that system becomes intellectually and functionally indefensible. It's built on a fantasy of limitless possibility that is completely divorced from necessity.
C.S. Lewis warned extensively about the end state of this process. Without clarity about the nature and inherent rights of human beings, which tradition and objective reality once provided, humanity faces what he called the abolition of man. The final moment of institutional collapse occurs when the system discovers that utopian ideals cannot make bridges stand up or airplanes fly safely.
When the ideological self-redemption sought by the therapeutic managerial state clashes violently with the non-negotiable demands of functional infrastructure and objective reality, the subsequent institutional collapse is merely the administrative fulfillment of the long-foretold abolition of man.